It seems like it'd be very challenging if your job is to help get the lights on, but your house may have been destroyed.
Right.
You know, and you talked about a little bit about the process of doing that, but elaborate specifically, if you could, on how you motivate them to, even though they've cried and they're acknowledging the pain they're going through, they still have to turn and focus on the work at hand, but it's still there. So I want to hear your thoughts on that from your experience, and then Joe, I wanted you to look at that from a perspective of, are there any ethical considerations with pulling people away, maybe potentially from their families to work,
Right.
because their work is so critical, and just that whole dynamic?
You know, all of us, regardless of our chosen profession or craft, when we get up in the morning, again, this goes to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we want the work that we do to be relevant, to be impactful in some way, shape, or form. The men and women who are in that business of managing that electric grid, they know and are motivated by the fact that absent power and their ability to restore power, communities don't get back on their feet. And so it was almost like a cause, a calling, if you will. We knew when the lights were out, it was our job to get it back on. We knew if we didn't somehow restore that power, that the community, the lifestyle, the way of life,
Would die.
we were done.
Yeah.
And so I appealed to their sense of higher calling and or purpose, which was part of their training, mind you. It wasn't just, again, a rah-rah speech. I appealed to the fact that this is our responsibility, and that people who don't know us, who could probably care less about us right about now, are absolutely depending on us. And so once I got beyond that basic need of how am I going to survive and deal, how's my family going to survive, I could more easily, I think, turn their attention to the fundamentals of our craft, of what it is we do for a living. 10 years later, I can make it sound a lot easier than it was, because let's be clear, not everybody made it, psychologically and or physically, but the lion's share of people accepted the challenge because we had trained them to understand the significance of the role for the greater good and the significance of their contribution to the team's success. And that goes to the point we were making earlier, that you don't wait until the crisis to drill the fundamentals. And that's where football, certainly decision-making, ethics, my legal training, all came into being, because my role wasn't to be an engineer in power systems. My toughest job was motivating people whose job it was to do that, to pursue their craft and training in the face of uncertainty, and to make the right decisions along the way, both in terms of immediacy and prioritization that was for the greater good. And that, let me tell you, there is no training for that. You want some fundamentals. It's like raising a child. You want to give your child the fundamentals to make good decisions, but you can't make the decisions for them.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Ethical thoughts?
Oh, well, that's inspiring. I'm listening to you, Rod. I'm reminded of a quote from an ancient Roman Cato, a statesman, who said that Cicero spoke and people marveled, Caesar spoke and people marched. So how do you speak to people in a way that they want to just say, oh, that's very nice sounding, but they actually want to march?
That's right.
They want to do something. Because, we'll all do what we need to do to keep our jobs, but then there's that discretionary citizenship behavior, the things you may or may not do depending on who's asking you and how they're asking you. So how do you get people to go that extra mile, or Katrina, more than a mile, for you? So Rod talked about, tapping into this sense of calling, of higher purpose, and I think that's great, because most people work because they need to work, they pay their bills and so forth. But I think most people also have a strain of idealism. Most people like to feel good about the work that they are devoting so much of their time and talent and energy to. So they want to find some sense of kind of meaning and fulfillment. And you talked about them having a duty to do that work, but a unique duty.
That's right.
I mean, there was nobody else to do it.
That's right.
And my understanding
No,
is that without the
that's absolutely
power,
right.
the pumps weren't going to work?
Nothing. Pumps,
Water's not
buildings,
going.
water, sewer, all of the factors of repopulation that we take for granted when you're moving from the Boston area to South Bend, you don't think for a second about running water, sewer, schools, grocery stores.
Take it for granted.
Take it for granted.
Yeah.
All of those fundamental landmarks, milestones for community were gone.
Yeah.
And we knew that unless we were able to get that fundamental resource, electricity, up and running, all the factors of repopulation wouldn't exist, and New Orleans would be left literally for dead.
Because you're in the bottom of the hierarchy.
You got it.
And you got to move up, but you can't move up until you've settled the bottom.
We used an analogy called the gumbo analogy, and in the Midwest, I guess it would be stew. But in a gumbo, the first thing you do, the base ingredients of a gumbo is the roux, the brown sauce that makes the soup. And we knew that we were the roux for the gumbo that would be the repopulation and resurgence of New Orleans. And we also knew that if we didn't do it in a timely manner, that Maslow's hierarchy of needs would force people to go elsewhere and repopulate elsewhere. And thus the likelihood, the more time it took, the likelihood of people coming back to New Orleans would wane. And so we kind of felt like it was on us if New Orleans was going to be rebuilt. And trust me, there's no higher calling than this enlightened sense of
mission, right?
Yeah, this call.
You know, in that sense of calling, we talk about the importance of freedom all the time, but there's an important difference between negative freedom, which is kind of freedom from the absence of external constraints. I don't live under tyrannical rule. I can do what I want to do, say what I want to say. You know, and that's necessary and important, and billions of people in the world don't have it, and we're yearning for it. But then beyond that, there's a notion of positive freedom, which is freedom for. So given that I could do whatever I want to do with my life and for my work, et cetera, what is worth devoting myself to? And I think a challenge of values-based leadership is to tap into the positive freedom of your employees, to give them a reason to want to get out of bed on Monday morning beyond the fact that they need to get the paycheck.
Joe, you're so right. We had employees who we literally in boats picked off of rooftops who were stranded after the storm on their roofs. And we found out because they had the last bit of juice in their battery to power the radio to let us know where they were. And to your point, when we picked them off the roof and we're trying to get them to safety, the only thing they were thinking about was rejoining the crews to help restore the power. And this was even before the water went down, where we could safely operate. We were in rescue mode because, again, the water didn't go down for several days. And there was no restoration as long as the water was there. And I remember marveling at the motivation, you know, because some people died on those roofs, but our employees, that's where I sort of tapped into this notion of this higher purpose or calling, is that these folks, either there was something that clicked where they, in order for their coping mechanism was to tap into that higher calling so that they would not either be overcome or distracted by the gravity of the catastrophe.
Right.
And I guess there was a part of it that was cathartic, that because this purpose was a reason to kind of rise above your own circumstance, it wound up being a survival tactic by default or by design to manage through. And I often thought about what it must have been like for folks coming back from the military, for instance. For those of us who went through it, you know, we look at each other and no explanation is necessary. Right. For those who haven't, sometimes no explanation would ever suffice.
Right.
And but I think about that when you speak about tapping into that higher purpose when managing through a crisis, because it is far from a blue sky environment and all the rules that we expect, the rules of hierarchy and command and control and a rules-based, a compliance-based ethos of normal leadership environment.
Right.
You got to go to the other playbook when the real bullets are flying.
Yeah, there's a leadership guru at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, Ronald Heifetz, and his team, and they talk about the notion of adaptive leadership based on this distinction between a technical challenge, which is one that you can solve by using existing personnel and ways of doing business and so forth, like how to make a car more fuel efficient, technical challenge. Adaptive challenge is one that's so far reaching that you got to throw out the old playbook. That it requires a different personnel or a different way of thinking or different way of doing things, and that requires kind of this notion of thinking outside the box and kind of believing in your people and all that. And it sounds clearly what you were facing was an adaptive challenge. In business right now, I mean, the newspaper industry is facing an adaptive challenge. People aren't buying the papers anymore. Kodak, when things went digital, faced an adaptive challenge. Blockbuster faced an adaptive challenge after Netflix came along. So how do you lead people in a way that they're committed, which clearly you had done, because they don't become committed the moment they find themselves in a group.
Right.
You had done some important leadership work before that. Committed, but also kind of adaptable.
And in current business environment today, the one risk that cuts across industries and organizational seams is cyber risk. And all of our businesses are trying to figure out how do we adapt to this existential threat that is cyber. And I just returned from a visit to Australia, where they deal with hurricanes, cyclones as they call them, in the same sense that we do here. And we were talking about it. It matters not whether it's a hurricane, whether it's drought or fire, or whether it's cyber. Risk is risk and loss is loss in terms of how you manage during a crisis, because the very lessons of Katrina that we were able to bring apply in both cyber circumstances, fire and what have you. And it's managing through that uncertainty. But your North Star has to be your raison d'etre as a firm, as a company, as a group, as an institution.
Why are we here?
Why are you here? And that becomes the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy pyramid for your company, for your family, for your city, for your region. And building upon that sort of sets the priority around which you make, and by which you make decisions, wrapped around this halo, I think it's an appropriate word, halo of ethics.